I'd now like to welcome Dr Abbie Wickham from the Guy's and St Thomas's psychology team. Dr Wickham is going to talk to us about looking after yourself and bridging into the new normal.
Welcome everyone to our event today, and thank you so much for listening in to my webinar here today. So my name's Abby. I'm a clinical psychologist working in the haematology department at Guy's Hospital. So I'm going to take a bit of time today just to talk to you about the psychological impact of COVID-19 and to have a think about some skills and strategies that might be helpful for you in coping with some of the challenges that you might be facing now or challenges that you might be facing in the future. Okay. So I've put together a list here which is based really on conversations that myself and my team have had with patients in our service, that we've had with each other, that we've had with friends and family, to highlight some of the main challenges and difficulties that COVID-19 has brought to us so far. So for many of us, we've found that we've not had contact with loved ones in the same way that we usually do, and that might mean that we're not seeing them as frequently as usual. It might mean that we can't see people face to face, or if we do, we can't get close to them. A lot of us have had changes in our jobs, whether that's things like working from home or different precautions we have to take at work or ways of working that are different now. For some of us, we may have been furloughed, and for some of us, we might be facing job insecurity and a lot of uncertainty there. A lot of us have found there's changes to our healthcare, different things that we might have to consider that we didn't before, different ways that we engage with our healthcare professionals. We might now be having some virtual appointments rather than face-to-face appointments. We might find that when we come to have our appointments, the way that that's done looks very different. We might also find that some of our appointments have been postponed or cancelled, and we don't know when they'll be rescheduled. Most of us, we've definitely experienced some changes in our daily activity to all sorts of different levels here. How we spend our time each day might look very different from how we did before. A lot of us has found that we're having to look for different ways to promote our well-being. Maybe activities we were used to doing before that would make us feel healthy or happy or fulfilled might not be available to us now, or not available to us in the same way as it was before. We're all having to be much more vigilant of our actions, having to think more carefully about certain things we do in ways that we didn't before. For example, different hygiene practices, social distancing, shielding. For a lot of us, we may have found that we've had to slow down quite a bit in our day-to-day life. If you are somebody who is very busy with lots of different commitments, you might find that looks very different for you right now, and that might sometimes feel like a negative thing, and for some people feel like a positive thing. I think all of us are dealing with a great deal of uncertainty at the moment, in lots of different ways, not knowing the answers to all the questions we might have, and not knowing what the future might look like. And for a lot of us, we've had some challenges along the way in ensuring some of our basic needs are met. So in the beginning of the pandemic, there were lots of problems about getting certain supplies. I'm thinking specifically about things like toilet paper here. And for those of us that have had to shield or stay at home, we've maybe had difficulties getting food delivered to us, and things have not been accessible as we were maybe used to before. So what kind of impact have some of those challenges, and many more that you may have been facing during this time, had on how we're feeling and our sense of well-being? So I've listed here some different emotions and experiences that I've heard a lot, again, from colleagues, patients, friends and family. A lot of people are experiencing a sense of loneliness or isolation at the moment, not being able to see people in the same way that they were used to. A lot of people are feeling fear at the moment, not knowing what will happen, fear about becoming unwell, what that will mean, fear about our loved ones becoming unwell, fear of what the future will hold. You've probably at some point experienced anger or frustration, being really annoyed that maybe you cannot do certain things, really annoyed you're stuck indoors, really annoyed that you've had to cancel important plans. You may have also experienced some sadness or some grief about things that you're not able to do, maybe events or celebrations that you're missing out on, holidays you've had to cancel. And for some of us, unfortunately, we may feel sadness and grief about people that we've lost during this period of time as well. A lot of people have experienced confusion, not knowing what's for the best, hearing lots of mixed messages about what we should be doing, what advice we should listen to. Some of us have felt very trapped or out of control at points, not being able to change the pandemic, not being able to have full control over our lives in a way that we did before, feeling trapped quite literally indoors sometimes, and in other ways in the limited options and decisions that we might have at the moment. A lot of us have felt overwhelmed at times. If many of these feelings are happening for us on a regular basis, and many of the challenges I discussed before are happening for us, that's a lot to take in at one point and a lot to cope with, which sometimes can feel like too much. You might have noticed that you're sometimes feeling hopeless because we don't know what the future may hold. It might be easy to lose hope that things will feel better or seem better soon. And actually, something that people have reported is a positive feeling, a sense of relief that's come out of this. So the idea that actually when you live with an NPN, sometimes you do have to take life at a slower pace than you may see other people doing. You may experience symptoms like fatigue, which means you have to think a bit more carefully about the plans you do or the responsibilities you take on. You may have already been experiencing a lot of concerns about your health and having to think about your health frequently in ways that people who don't have an NPN may not have to do. And what some people have reported to us, that actually there's a sense of relief that the world is slowing down a little bit in a way that feels more manageable, and that people might be able to have a little bit of an understanding as to some of the challenges that you may have already been facing prior to this. So what are we facing next? The bottom line to this really is that this is completely uncertain, as with almost everything we've faced so far with this pandemic. It might be that there's changing to shielding. You may have already experienced this in your personal circumstances, that the advice that you're given now from your medical team might be different from before. Changes to the advice the government has given will, I'm sure, continue to change in the future. And a sense that, is there a new normal? What things will go back to normal and when? Will there be some things that we'll be doing differently for longer? Will they ever return to how they were? We just don't know. So how can I cope with this? This is probably the question that I'm asked a lot in my role, that I think about a lot myself, and that I think the questions that my friends, family and colleagues are all asking themselves: how can we cope with the different challenges that this pandemic is bringing for each of us? So I'm going to talk through a couple of different skills now that you might find helpful, some that you may already be trying yourselves or have tried, some that you may have been told by somebody else already. But hopefully within this list there'll be things that you can think about and take away that will help you cope with some of the challenges that you might be facing now, or that you find you might be facing in the future. So the first thing that I would say is to remind yourself and remember that it is normal to feel any and all of the things that you're experiencing at the moment. This is a global pandemic, and unfortunately that means we're not supposed to feel okay all of the time. In fact, it might be a bit more unusual if we were. It's really normal to feel scared, frustrated, anxious, tired, fed up, maybe sometimes relieved. All of these things are okay. And in fact, things like anxiety and fear at the moment are in a way quite a healthy response for us, because we do have to be thoughtful at the moment, and there are risks to us at the moment that were not present perhaps before. And what anxiety and fear does is remind us to pay attention to those things, and to take notice of them. And one thing that I've mentioned before that we are certainly all facing, and I'm sure we'll continue to face, is a lot of uncertainty, and our brains really do not like uncertainty. Our brains like to understand everything that's going on, and our brains also like to believe that they can predict everything that will be happening in the future and what we can expect. And like most things in life, that is not possible at the moment for a lot of things. And what our brain does when it faces that difficulty is to respond with anxiety, to try and prompt us to do something. And of course, sometimes we can do something with the challenges we're facing, and sometimes we can't. So another piece of advice that I would give is to focus only on what you can control. So it's human nature, as I said, to want to control everything possible and have lots of certainty, but there are so many things at the moment, and quite honestly before, that are out of our control and that we cannot be uncertain about. And to try and change things that we cannot alter can actually bring additional frustration and suffering to the challenges that we're already facing. So what I would recommend is you look at the things that you actually can do and the choices that you actually do have, and focus your attention on those only. Another thing that I would suggest would be quite helpful is to notice and name what you're feeling. It's likely that you are or have or will experience a lot of difficult emotions during the pandemic, and we can often feel that ignoring or suppressing those emotions will help get rid of them, particularly if they feel overwhelming at times. And in fact, what people tend to find when they do that is it has the opposite effect. Our emotions tend to build up and eventually will overspill. So what can be much more useful is to acknowledge and notice what you're feeling when you're feeling it. And what people tend to find is that just diffuses the intensity of that emotion at least a little bit. And what some people find helpful is to talk through those kind of experiences with someone that they trust, to help understand what's going on and to help release some of that tension that is building. Another thing that I would suggest is to stay in the present moment. So often with difficult emotions like anxiety, for example, or fear, they come hand in hand with a number of difficult thoughts, such as things like worries. And the thing with worries is that they place our mind very much in the future, or the future that we imagine will occur. And that brings us additional struggles to what we might be facing right now in the present moment. And there are also things that we can't do anything to change because we don't yet know what the future will hold. So what can be quite useful is to notice when your mind is doing that, when your mind is bringing you to the future rather than keeping you where you are now, and to actually focus on what your needs are now. What are the challenges I'm facing right now? What are the difficult experiences I'm having right now? And what do I need to manage those now? And you might find that it's a lot easier to manage some of the challenges you're facing when you look at things in that way. One thing that can really help to keep our minds in the present moment, but to also calm some of the intense emotions that we might experience at times, is to use some breathing exercises. So the reason why that's quite helpful is because, as I'm sure most of you have experienced, that when you feel a very difficult and intense emotion, you will also feel some quite difficult and challenging physical experiences as well. So for example, if you're feeling a lot of anxiety or fear, you might notice things like your heart racing. You might notice that you can feel it pounding in your chest in a way that you couldn't before. You might then find that your breathing becomes shallower and quicker. You might find that you sweat or you become hot. And those things are very closely linked. So the more that we feel the emotion, the more that we're going to feel the physical elements of that as well. So the more anxious you are, the more you're likely to feel your heart racing, your breath quickening, feeling very hot and tense. So the relationship between those two things works both ways. So if we have more anxiety, we get more physical symptoms, and if we get more physical symptoms, we get more anxiety. So one way to take control of that really uncomfortable pattern that we can get stuck in is to do something to regulate our physical experience a little bit. So one thing that a lot of people find quite helpful is to do a breathing exercise which controls the pace of your breath and brings it back down to a much more normal resting pace, which will help your anxiety to come back down to a normal resting pace for you as well. So I'll show you here just a suggestion of a breathing exercise. So this is a little bit different for each person because our own lung capacity and what's comfortable will slightly differ between us. But the first thing I would suggest you do is to make sure you're sitting upright and to place your hand on your diaphragm, which is sort of just underneath your lungs. And this helps you to be a bit more aware of your breath, because sometimes when you're feeling intense emotions, you're not noticing your breathing, but often it's much easier to follow your hand rising and falling and getting a sense of how quickly you're breathing in that way. So what I would start with is always breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And in the middle of that, try and have a moment where you hold your breath and pause. So you'll see on the slides here that I've made a suggestion about breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, exhaling for 6 seconds. This really differs between each person, so don't worry if this doesn't feel comfortable. What people normally find comfortable is to breathe out a bit longer than they breathe in, but not everybody. And 4 seconds does actually often feel like a long time to hold your breath. So what I would recommend before you have a go at this is have a bit of a practice when you're already feeling kind of calm. Get a sense of what your usual comfortable, controlled, deep breathing pace is, and then you know that for at times when you're experiencing difficult emotions and you want to use it to take down the intensity of those. What is quite important, as I said, we're experiencing potentially a lot of difficult emotions at the moment, and they're all natural, and for many of those examples it's not possible to fully get rid of them. We're supposed to be feeling some difficult emotions at the moment. But what is important when we're experiencing that is to see ourselves through to the other side and to take care of ourselves during that experience. So thinking about ways to comfort yourself when you're experiencing those things is really important. And I find that a good place to start is to think about things that you physically find soothing. So it's quite useful to think about it in the sense of, what do I find soothing in my 4 senses? So what things can I look at? What things can I hear? Can I touch? Can I taste? Or can I smell? And I've placed some examples at the bottom of things that people have said to me before they find quite useful to soothe themselves. So it might be something like burning a scented candle that you really like, listening to a calm or uplifting song, or snuggling up in a nice soft blanket. Distraction is quite a useful technique, which might sound a bit contradictory to what I said earlier about not ignoring or suppressing your emotions, but actually distraction's different because you acknowledge what you're feeling and you're choosing to spend a period of time taking your mind off it to give yourself a little bit of respite. It can be really tiring to experience difficult thoughts and emotions all day, every day. So if you're going through a period where there's difficulties that make you feel that way a lot of the time, it's important to take breaks from that where you can, so you can recharge. So thinking about activities that you can do that will help you to fully engage your mind in that activity, and going back to what we said earlier about being mindful of when you notice your brain thinking about other things, when you notice your brain focusing on worries or thinking about other things you need to do. Notice that and just bring your mind back to that activity. And this is something that a lot of people have found very important but also very difficult during the pandemic, is to continue to do things that matter to you as an individual. And it might be that a lot of things that matter to you and that brought you positive experiences like pleasure, joy, a sense of calm or a sense of fulfillment are not available to you like they were before. So you might have to be very creative about how you would engage with these activities. So for example, for somebody who really liked to exercise before, they might have to think very differently about how they might do that indoors, or ways they might do that outdoors without access to a gym. And this is something that's really important to think about right now, is making decisions that are right for you as an individual. So at the moment, what a lot of people are finding is there is not a blanket guidance for everybody, and it's different for each person and their circumstances. And so people are beginning to make decisions about how they want to conduct their day-to-day life. And what's really important in that is to think about familiarising yourself with the advice specific to you and your condition and your circumstances. So this might be taking into account things like your specific diagnosis, any other health conditions you may or may not have, and what particular treatment you might be on. And it's really important that you take into account what advice you've been told by your medical team as to what elements of this are important for you to hold in mind. And it's important when you're thinking about decisions to weigh up the benefits and risks. And often what we find when we're making decisions is that it's unlikely there is an option which is perfect and risk-free, which can make it quite difficult for us to come to a conclusion about what we want to do. So it's important that we're weighing that up. We're acknowledging what are the benefits of me doing said thing and what are the risks that could be involved. And acknowledging that there is a degree of risk in everything that you do. And with COVID, there's no way at the moment to categorically guarantee that somebody will not catch it. And that's important to hold in mind. It's also important to think about what resources and knowledge that you have and really trust that. You know about your condition, you know how your body works, and you know what experiences you've had so far. And think about what precautions you can take, what advice you have been given, and how you can use all of that to make the best choice for you at any given moment. Another thing I would advise is that you take gradual steps. So it might be the case that either now or previously or in the future, the things that you are able to do or the things that you have been advised is okay to do or the things that you wish to do might be different from in previous moments in the pandemic. And that can feel quite daunting to maybe go back to activities that you haven't done for a long time that might feel scary or carry some risks for you. And it's important to think about easing back into anything that you wish to in a gradual way. And not to expect yourself to be able to jump right back in as if the pandemic had never happened. And it's important to remember at this time to expect anxiety. When you go back to doing something you haven't done for a while, it's completely natural and healthy to feel nervous about that. And to hold in mind that the more that you do something, the more comfortable that it's likely to feel for you over time. And I've included a picture here of something our psychologists like to talk about a lot, the idea of a stress bucket. So it's the idea that we don't have an infinite capacity for stress, and that's why it's important to think about ways that we can alleviate and manage it. So the idea of the stress bucket is that the water that fills the bucket is all the different things in your life that might be challenging and causing you different types of stress. So maybe some of the things we talked about at the start of this webinar, maybe some additional things that are going on in your life, or maybe some things that I haven't mentioned today. So the more water that fills in that bucket, the more and more you get closer to your full capacity where you're not able to hold any more stress in that bucket. And so what's really important is to think about ways that you can drain some of that water from your stress bucket, drill some holes in the bottom so that you've got capacity for more should it come your way. So I'm hoping today that some of the things that we've talked about might sound useful to you and might serve as the drill that you can use to put a hole in the bottom of your stress bucket and let some of that out. And here I just briefly included a helpful summary of some of the skills we've talked about today, things that will be helpful in facing COVID, as it says here. This is by Russ Harris, somebody who does a lot of work in psychology about coping with difficult emotions and difficult experiences. So you can have a look at that as a way to remind you of some of the things we've talked about today. And I've also included here some links that you might find useful. There's some things here for relaxation tracks. There's some things here for different exercises that you might find useful. There's a bit there about ways you can exercise from home if you wish to. And there's a really useful website there which talks about all different activities that you can be doing at home. And there's some more here as well. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for listening today. I really hope that at least something I've said today is useful to you. And well done for anyone trying these things already. I hope they're really helpful to you. And I wish you the best of luck with everything you face in the future and with trying out some of these skills.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wickham, for your very useful tips for us all as we go into this new world post-shielding.